In October 1915, in a city that had learned how to whisper, an empire decided to do something that still feels wrong even when you try to justify it with paperwork. They executed a nurse, not in a back alley, not in the chaos of a riot, but after interrogations, after a court-martial, under military law, with signatures and stamps, and men who could sleep at night because the document said the killing was necessary. The details matters because what makes the Edith Cavell story so unsettling is that it does not appear at first like a monument of uncontrolled violence. It looks organized, it looks administrative, it looks procedural. And that is precisely what makes it so disturbing even today. This is not simply a story about wartime cruelty. It is a moral thriller disguised as a biography, because the closer you examine it, the more you begin to understand that the most frightening violence of modern war often arrives wearing a clean uniform and speaking calmly in the language of rules, legality, and duty. On the morning of October 12, 1915, in occupied Brussels, Edith Cavell, 49 years old, British, a senior nurse and matron, was led to the Tyr National Shooting Range. She did not arrive as a combatant, nor as someone who had commanded troops or ordered men to die. She arrived as a woman whose profession was to keep people alive, and yet she was about to be killed by a state that believed it was defending itself. Edith Cavell had done something that appeared to be an act of mercy, something that in almost any other context would have been recognized as compassion, and yet the machinery of war interpreted it as a strategic crime. This contradiction is what keeps her story alive. It is the reason people continue to argue about it more than a century later, because the central question the story raises is painfully simple and deeply uncomfortable. In a total war, is mercy a virtue or is it treason? To understand how an execution like this could happen, you have to imagine the psychological climate of occupation. Brussels under German control was not a city permanently burning. It was something quieter and more suffocating than that. It was a city governed by rules, posters on walls, proclamations in public squares, checkpoints on streets, soldiers watching, boots echoing against stone. Life continued, but it continued under observation. Under those conditions, people began to feel the quiet pressure of interpretation, the sense that every movement might be judged, that every conversation might be overheard, that your entire existence could suddenly be reduced to whether you appear suspicious when a soldier asks a question. And in that environment, the first thing that dies is not the body. The first thing that disappears is the illusion that you can live two lives at once, one private and one public, without the machinery of power eventually noticing the gap between them. Edith Cavell did not begin her life as a symbol. She was born in 1865 in Swardeston, a small village near Norwich, in the kind of England where duty was not an abstract ideal, but an everyday habit. Her father served as an Anglican vicar for decades, and the world she grew up in taught her a particular kindness of seriousness. It was a world that valued discipline, responsibility, and the quiet conviction that when help is needed, you give it. She was not raised to pursue greatness or recognition. She was raised to be useful, to be steady, to do what was necessary without expecting applause. That upbringing matters because discipline is not simply obedience. Discipline is endurance. It is the ability to continue doing what you believe is right, even when fear begins to whisper that stopping might be safer. And if Edith Cavell had a flaw that later became fatal, it was not selfishness or pride. It was a stubborn moral consistency that refused to bend even when bending might have saved her life. Before becoming a nurse, she worked as a governess and spent time in Brussels during the 1890s, learning the rhythms of the city and the language of life beyond England. When her father became seriously ill, she returned home to care for him, and that experience altered the direction of her life. It drew her toward nursing not merely as employment, but as vocation. She trained at a London hospital under the demanding supervision of matron Eva Lucas, one of the figures responsible for transforming nursing into a modern professional discipline. During the Maidstone typhoid epidemic, an outbreak that infected thousands and killed over 100, Edith encountered suffering on a scale that forced a very simple realization into sharp focus. Illness does not care about nationality. Fever does not ask what side you're on. A wound does not care what anthem you sing. Those lessons seem almost obvious, until you remember that war is constructed on the opposite assumption that some lives matter more than others because of the flag sewn onto a uniform. In 1907, she accepted the position that would define her career. She became the matron of a newly established nursing school in Brussels, recruited by Dr. Antoine Depage, a prominent Belgian surgeon connected to the Belgian Red Cross. At that time, Belgium's nursing system was still shaped by older traditions, and Edith Cavell brought with her organization training standards in modern medical discipline. She introduced structure where there had been improvisation and professionalism where that had been informality. By the time the war began, she had already become known as one of the pioneers of modern nursing in Belgium. She was not simply treating patients, she was building an institution. She was training nurses who would eventually work across hospitals and clinics throughout the country. It was work that was not glamorous, but it was powerful. Infrastructure rarely attracts attention during peace, but in wartime, any form of organized activity inevitably becomes visible. When the First World War erupted in August 1914, Edith was visiting her widowed mother in England. Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium transformed the conflict into something that Britain could not ignore, and within hours, Britain declared war. Edith Cavell could have remained safely in England. She had every excuse to do so. She had nationality, age, and status. No one would have judged her decision if she had stayed away from danger. But she returned to Brussels. To her, the decision did not feel dramatic or heroic. It felt logical. Her work was there. The wounded were there. That was where she believed she was needed. And in wartime, people who simply continue doing what they believe is their duty sometimes become the most dangerous people of all, because they do not think of themselves as dangerous. In occupied Brussels, her nursing school and clinic were taken over by the Red Cross, and she treated wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict: German soldiers, Allied soldiers, and civilians. The German authorities allowed her to continue her work, provided that she obeyed the rules imposed by the occupation. At first, she appeared useful rather than threatening, but gradually a pattern began to appear. Allied soldiers would arrive injured, exhausted, and trapped behind enemy lines. They would receive treatment, and then, quietly, they would disappear. They were not officially discharged. They were not handed over to the authorities. They simply vanished. And it did not happen once. It happened again and again, until suspicion became inevitable. Occupation governments do not fear isolated acts of kindness. They fear organized systems. They fear routes. They fear networks that quietly move people from one safe place to another. Edith Cavell had become part of such a network. In the light, she remained the disciplined matron moving through hospital corridors with professional calm, tending wounds, changing bandages, speaking softly to patients who could not sleep because of pain. But beyond those visible routines, she had also become a central figure in an underground network that helped Allied soldiers escape from Germany-occupied Belgium into the neutral Netherlands. These operations were not dramatic acts of espionage. They were small, Quiet actions repeated again and again. A hidden room, a set of civilian clothes, a false identity document, a few coins pressed into a stranger's hand. Whispered instructions about where to walk and when to remain silent. Around her were other participants, people like Philip Bock and priest Reginald de Croix, but Edith became essential because she possessed something unusual. She had access, credibility, and the appearance of harmlessness. A nurse could move between worlds. A nurse could hide defiance behind care. Yet, the moral tension of her situation was immediate and permanent. Edith Cavell continued to treat German soldiers while helping Allied soldiers escape. She did not abandon care for the enemy. She saved German lives while assisting the enemies of Germany. That contradiction is precisely what makes her story so powerful. It forces you into a place of discomfort where the usual categories of hero and villain begin to blur. Her actions were guided by a single principle. If a life can be saved, it should be saved. But war does not easily accept that principle. War prefers clearer loyalties. War demands that compassion follow the boundaries of the battlefield. When compassion refuses to obey those boundaries, it becomes suspicious. Eventually, the network's success became its weakness. The more soldiers it helped escape, the more evidence accumulated. German authorities began to notice the pattern. Investigations began. Secret police questioned staff and observed routines. Suspicion grew slowly, gathering weight until finally the network collapsed. In August 1915, Edith Cavell was arrested and charged with harboring Allied soldiers and helping them escape. During interrogation, she confessed. Not because she misunderstood the danger, but because honesty was part of her character in a way that wartime systems rarely tolerate. Her confession provided the German authorities with a clear legal case. Under German military law, aiding enemy soldiers could be punished by death. Edith Cavell spent roughly 10 weeks in St. Gilles prison awaiting her fate. 10 weeks confined within a narrow place where every passing footstep in the corridor might signal the next stage of her story. During that time, she displayed a calm that many observers later described as remarkable. It was not that she lacked fear, it was that her moral framework gave her a kind of stability that the chaos of war could not easily destroy. On the night before her execution, she received Holy Communion from an Anglican chaplain, and afterward she spoke the sentence that would become the most famous line associated with her life. Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone. Those words carried an almost subversive power. War requires hatred to sustain itself. It requires people to believe the enemy is something less than human. Edith Cavell rejected that emotional simplification even as she faced death. On the morning of October 12, 1915, she was executed by firing squad. Her death caused outrage around the world. Newspapers reported the story widely, and propaganda quickly transformed her into a symbol. Posters depicted the execution of a defenseless nurse by German soldiers, intensifying anger and strengthening recruitment campaigns. And here lies one of the most tragic ironies of the First World War. Edith Cavell's final words rejected hatred, yet her death became a powerful source of hatred on an international scale. The war took her refusal to hate and converted it into fuel for further conflict. After the war, her body was returned to Britain, where she was buried at Norwich Cathedral, following a memorial service at Westminster Abbey. Monuments were erected in several countries. Her words were carved into stone. Gradually, as often happens with historical figures, the human being was transformed into an icon. Yet, behind the icon remains the question that makes her story so difficult to resolve. Because Edith Cavell was not simply a victim or a hero. She was a person navigating an ethical landscape that war had made almost impossible. And that is why the story still resonates. It forces us to ask a question that cannot be answered comfortably. If the world around you suddenly became brutal and helping someone meant risking your own life, would you stop? Would you tell yourself it was not your responsibility, not your war, not your problem? Or would you become dangerous in the same quiet way Edith Cavell became dangerous, without weapons, without hatred, simply by refusing to let fear decide who deserves mercy? Because she did not die shouting slogans or cursing the soldiers who aimed their rifles at her. She died trying to keep bitterness out of her heart. And the fact that an empire considered that kind of person dangerous enough to execute should make us wonder what war truly fears. Sometimes it is not the bullets or spies. Sometimes what war fears most is the person who proves that even in the middle of violence, you still have a choice. Hi guys, I'm Arthur, the creator of War Never Changes. I hope you've liked this video. Please consider subscribing to my channel, leaving your like, and also to activate the bell for notifications so you can see our newest videos, right? As you guys already know, I'm a Brazilian medical student, and my dream, my quest, is for the revalidation in the US, to be a US doctor, right? Via the USMLE steps. But for that purpose, I need money, and I don't have money, so here am I. And for that purpose, I'm selling my newest ebook. It is called Love in No Man's Land, 9 True Love Stories from the First World War, right? It contains 2 main editions. The collector's edition, which contains the main book with 1 additional war love story, the 10th story, right? It also has exclusive artwork for all of our war love stories. You also get a customized 100 pages notebook for War Never Changes. You also get an insignia, the War Lover insignia. So it proves that you fought with me in this first phase project, right? And it also has some private intel. Private intel number 1. What does it contain? I cannot tell you because it is private, confidential. Only those who buy it will know. This edition, it contains only 2,500 units left, so you should run, you should buy it fast, right? Please consider buying it. But if you don't want to buy it, shame on you, actually. But it also has a standard edition. It costs only $10, and it contains the main book with 9 more love stories. So if you're interested, please consider checking the description below, the link for the book. And I hope I see you in the next videos. So thank you once more, and always remember, war never changes.